Welcome to Bedtime History with Sam. Tonight we're boarding the Titanic, but through a part of the ship that almost never appears in photographs. Not the staircase under the glass dome, not the first-class rooms with their polished wood and their fresh flowers. We're going underneath all of that. Into the narrow corridors and the crowded cabins, the working kitchens, the sorting rooms, and the furnace decks that made every comfort above them possible. Settle in wherever you are. There's nothing here you need to remember, and nowhere this story needs to get to. For the next little while, we're simply going to follow the ship downward, one deck at a time, and see who's there. If you have a moment before you drift off, leave your listening place in the comments. I like seeing how far these stories travel. Wednesday, the 10th of April, 1912. Southampton. The third-class passengers begin arriving early, some of them after a night in boarding houses near the dock, some waiting with their luggage close by, hours before there's any need to. Somewhere in this crowd is a family from Peterborough, John Sage, his wife Annie, and their 9 children, from Stella at 20 down to Thomas at 4. 11 tickets. They're bound for Florida, where John intends to farm. 11 third-class tickets, at £7 to £8 each, against a laboring wage of roughly £1 a week, close to 2 years of a working man's earnings, handed over in one transaction, for a journey intended to remake the family's life. That's the shape of nearly every decision on this gangway. Not a holiday, the largest financial act of a life. There's a doctor at the foot of it, checking eyes and scalps and hands. He's looking mainly for trachoma, an infectious eye condition that could stop someone being let into America, and if that happened, the shipping line would have to pay their passage home again. It takes seconds. Nearly everyone passes. And then they're up the gangway and inside, and the noise of the dock drops away behind them, and we can go down. Here's something that isn't in most tellings of this story, and it changes who is standing on that gangway. For 5 weeks that winter, the coal miners of Britain had been on strike. Nearly 1 million men. It was the largest stoppage the country had ever had, and by the time it ended in early April, the coal bunkers of the shipping lines were close to empty. So the sailings stopped. Not all of them, but enough. Ships that were supposed to leave Southampton in the first weeks of April simply didn't because there was no fuel to send them across. And the passengers who had bought tickets on those ships had to be put somewhere. The Sage family, the 11 from Peterborough, were not originally booked on this ship at all. They were booked on a steamer called the Philadelphia. When her sailing was canceled, the line moved them. The Goodwins were the same. Frederick Goodwin was an electrical engineer, traveling with his wife Augusta and 6 children, the youngest 19 months old, to Niagara Falls, where his brother had arranged him work at the power station. 1 ticket, £46 and 18 shillings for the 8 of them. They had been booked on a smaller ship. The strike moved them here. So a great many of the people we're about to walk past did not choose this ship. They were transferred onto it, in the ordinary administrative way, because of a labor dispute in the coal fields that had nothing to do with any of them. Tonight it simply explains why these particular families are aboard at all. Let's go inside. The first surprise comes almost immediately, and it's worth understanding why it's a surprise. Third class on an Atlantic liner in 1912 usually meant a dormitory. A long, open compartment, rows of iron bunks, sometimes 100 people in one space, no privacy at all, and no door that shuts. That's what most of these passengers are braced for, and some of them, forward among the single men, will get something close to it. But most of them won't. What they find is a corridor, plain, painted white, lit by bulbs at intervals, with numbered doors along it. and behind the doors, cabins. 2 berths or 4, iron-framed, made up with white sheets and a blanket carrying the line's name. Many of them have a simple wash basin, a mirror, a hook for clothing, and a single electric light in the ceiling, which for a great many people aboard is itself a novelty, because home is lit by oil. The plainest accommodation, forward among the single men, is barer than that. A 4-berth cabin is about the size of a modern bathroom. 2 people fit comfortably. 4 fit if they cooperate. But it has a door, and the door closes. On a space that is yours, and the 3 people you're sharing with, and nobody else, for 6 days. For a considerable number of people aboard this ship, that small white room is the most private space they have ever slept in. The way these cabins are arranged tells you how 1912 thought about people. Single men are housed forward, in the bow. Families and single women are placed aft, in the stern. Between the two lies the entire length of the ship's machinery and working spaces, keeping the 2 groups about as far apart as the vessel allows. Nobody aboard would have thought that needed explaining. And here's where nearly every telling of this story reaches for the same statistic, that 700 third-class passengers shared 2 bathtubs. I went looking for where that comes from, and I couldn't find it. It traces back to a trivia book, and the shipbuilder's own plans appear to show more than 2, so I'm not going to give you a number. What's true is the shape of it. Bathing in 3rd class was communal, it was rationed, and you asked a steward for it rather than simply going. A handful of tubs served everybody. By modern standards, that sounds uncomfortable. It wasn't quite, and the reason matters. In 1912, a bath is a weekly event, not a daily one, and it involves a tin tub, a kettle, a great deal of effort, and several members of a family using the same water, one after another. Against that, a tiled room with a tub and hot water coming out of a tap is not a hardship, it's a marvel. Several passengers mentioned the hot water specifically in accounts afterwards. Hold on to that hot water. We'll find out where it comes from later, and the answer is stranger than you'd think. Before we go further down, we should stop 1 deck up, because there's a part of this ship that behaves very strangely on this crossing. 2nd class was built for 510 people. 285 sailed. A little over half full. Which meant that a schoolmaster named Lawrence Beasley, who had paid £13 for his passage, found himself with a 2-berth cabin entirely to himself. Beasley matters to us tonight. He was a science teacher. He wrote a book about the crossing later that same year, and he noticed the kind of small physical detail that almost nobody else thought worth writing down. He is the closest thing we have to someone walking this ship with a notebook. 2nd class had its own library, oak-paneled with mahogany furniture, writing desks, a bookcase behind glass, and windows looking onto a covered promenade. And it had a librarian, not a passenger who volunteered, a young man on the crew list, 19 years old, whose entire job aboard this ship was the books. Think about that for a moment. Somewhere below him, men were shoveling coal in front of open furnaces. And here was a 19-year-old whose work was to sit in a quiet oak room and hand out novels. Both of those jobs existed on the same ship, at the same hour, about 100 feet apart. 2nd class had a lift of its own, too, something these 2 sister ships introduced, and believed to be the first time any line had bothered to put a lift in 2nd class at all. The cabins were plain. Linoleum instead of carpet, white walls, a washstand, 2 berths or 4. Comfortable rather than grand. The people aboard who had crossed the Atlantic before seemed to think it was the most comfortable ship they had been on. Now, down. Now come up one deck to E deck and stand at one end of a corridor. It runs almost the entire length of the ship along the left-hand side, wide enough for 2 men to pass with a trolley between them. Painted steel lit at intervals with no decoration whatsoever. The crew call it Scotland Road. Nobody's entirely sure why, though a great many of them came from Liverpool, and Liverpool has a Scotland Road of its own, long, straight, and busy, so the name probably just came aboard with them. Stand here a moment and watch. A steward comes down the far end carrying folded linen, passes without looking up, turns through an unmarked door, and vanishes into a passage running toward the passenger cabins. A minute later, 2 men off watch go by in the other direction, coal dust in the creases of their necks, not talking. Somewhere behind us a trolley is moving over a joint in the deck plates, the same sound at the same interval, over and over. This corridor is the ship's spine. Everything moves through here. Linen, food, coal, messages, crew, and third-class passengers heading aft toward their own rooms. At any hour of the day or night, Scotland Road has somebody in it. And that's the thing about this ship that's genuinely hard to hold in your head. Above the waterline, in the first-class dining saloon, a string quintet is playing, and 11 courses are being served to a room full of people who paid a great deal of money to experience calm. That calm is manufactured, continuously, by roughly 900 people moving at speed through a plain steel corridor 30 feet below, all night, so that the calm upstairs can keep happening. There's no hour in these 6 days when nobody is working. Follow that steward for a moment. He's a bedroom steward, responsible for a handful of first-class staterooms. He wakes passengers who've asked to be woken. He brings tea. He takes shoes away at night and returns them polished before morning. He turns down beds, carries messages, fetches things from the baggage hold, deals with seasickness. He sleeps in a berth off a corridor near his section, sharing with other stewards, and he is on call in a sense that has no modern equivalent, because there is nowhere else on this ship for him to be. Further along, past another door, the galley. Somewhere in it a kitchen boy of about 16 is washing dishes for a kitchen serving several thousand meals a day in relays. And down at the forward end, the bakery. The chief baker is 33 years old, from Birkenhead, with 13 bakers under him. Fresh bread has to be produced daily in enormous quantity, which means that at the hour when much of the ship is quietest, the ovens down here are already lit. None of these men appear in the photographs. All of them are aboard tonight. Everything you have seen so far, the made beds, the clean towels, the food arriving warm, the corridors that stay swept, is produced by a single department, and it is by far the largest one on the ship. There were about 885 crew aboard. 66 of them sailed the ship, the seamen, the quartermasters, the lookouts. Around 325 ran the machinery, the firemen, the trimmers, the greasers, the engineers, and nearly 500 looked after the passengers, stewards and stewardesses, cooks, bakers, butchers, pantrymen, bellboys. More than half the crew of this ship existed simply to take care of the people traveling on it. Stewardesses were paid slightly less than the men doing comparable work. The difference is written into the crew agreement, and no reason for it is given anywhere. The stewards slept in rooms they called glory holes. One first-class bedroom steward was asked, under oath afterwards, how many men slept in his room on E-deck. He said, 19 of us. 19, including him.
The stewardesses did better.
They slept two to a cabin, scattered through the passenger decks near the people they looked after, in rooms with washstands and wardrobes that were not far off passenger accommodation. One of them was Violet Jessup, 24 years old, born in Argentina to Irish parents, living in London. She had already served on the Olympic, this ship's older sister. She would go on to serve on the third sister too, as a nurse, during the war. All three of them. She kept going back to sea, and she worked at it until she was in her 60s. How many passengers did one steward look after? There was no fixed number. In first class it might be 9 rooms. In third class, one steward said he had charge of somewhere about 58 people. And then there were the bellboys. There were 3 of them, not 50, which is the number you will find repeated in a great many places. 3. Arthur Barrett, 15, Clifford Harris, 16, William Watson, 14. £2 a month each. 14 years old, in a uniform with brass buttons, on the North Atlantic, working. One last detail, and it only survives by accident. One of the stewards kept the bill from his tailor in Southampton. Boots, a suit, shirts, boot polish. The stewards bought their own uniforms. He had spent more than a month's wages on the clothes he was standing up in. Here is a quieter problem the shipping line had to solve. More than 1 person in 5 aboard this ship did not speak English. They could not follow an announcement, could not read a notice, could not ask a steward a question and be understood. For hundreds of passengers speaking many different languages, the ship carried one official third-class interpreter. His name was Ludwig Müller. He was German, in his 30s, living in Southampton, and he had come across from the Olympic. He signed on 6 days before she sailed. We don't even know for certain which languages he spoke. Nobody wrote it down. What we do have is one of his colleagues describing him at work, under oath, moving among the passengers, getting them from one end of the ship to the other while they carried their luggage with them. The trunks and the cases and all of it. And the phrase that steward used, without thinking about it, was, his people. A great deal depended on his being nearby when somebody needed him. Now down again, as far down as it's possible to go. Below the passenger decks, below the cargo holds, below the waterline, the ship stops being a hotel and becomes a machine. 29 boilers, 159 furnaces, and working them, roughly 160 firemen, everyone calls them stokers, and 73 trimmers, divided into watches that cover every hour of the day and night. The warmth reaches you before you see anything. Then the sound, not the roar you might expect, but shovels and furnace doors and coal being moved. Everything here has a rhythm to it. A door opens, coal is spread across the fire, the ash is cleared away. Then the same careful work begins again. A stoker stands in front of an open fire door and shovels coal into it. He rakes it flat so it burns evenly, and clears away the clinker, the hard ash left behind by the burning coal, and then does it again. 4 hours. That's a watch. Then 8 hours off, then again, around the clock, the whole crossing. He works with as little heavy clothing as the conditions allow, and he drinks constantly, moving between the furnace doors. The trimmer works in a different kind of difficulty. Coal doesn't deliver itself. It sits in bunkers alongside the boiler rooms, and as it's used up, it has to be dragged forward from the back of the bunker, where the light is faint and coal dust hangs heavily in the air, and barrowed along to the stokers. He's also responsible for keeping the coal evenly distributed, so the ship doesn't develop a list from burning one side faster than the other. The word is literal. He trims the ship. Now think about what happens when his watch ends. He comes up out of that heat into a ship where the air is cool, and coming away from a stokehold into the cooler parts of the vessel is an abrupt physical change. He washes if he can. Coal dust doesn't come out of skin easily, and it doesn't come out of the creases at all. Around the eyes, in the neck, under the nails. It stays. Then he eats, in a mess room near the accommodation, and then he tries to sleep in a bunk close enough to the machinery that the vibration is not a background sound, but a physical fact in the frame of the bed. 8 hours later he does it again. Here's what I keep returning to. At any given moment, a passenger on the boat deck could be breathing cold Atlantic air, while a trimmer in a coal bunker at that same instant worked in oppressive heat and coal dust in the dark. They breathe different air, and their paths are very unlikely ever to cross. In the ordinary running of this ship, there's no real occasion for a passenger and a trimmer to be in the same place at the same time. Much of the comfort upstairs depends on the work going on down here. Let's stop in the doorway here, because this is the room that explains all the rest of it. One deck up from the boilers, the steam those men have made arrives somewhere. 2 enormous steam engines, each rising several decks high, a turbine behind them driving the center propeller, and attending all of it, a different body of men entirely: engineers, greasers, oilers, electricians. If the stokers are the muscle, these are the nerves. They don't shovel, they watch. They walk lines of gauges, they feel bearings for heat with the back of a hand. They listen, genuinely listen, for a change in a sound they know well enough to notice a difference of a single note. And what they're really tending isn't the propellers, it's everything else. Because the boilers did far more than turn the propellers. The wider steam plant fed most of the systems that made this ship comfortable and usable and possible at all. They help make electricity. 4 steam-powered generators, dynamos they were called then, running continuously, feeding something in the region of 10,000 lamps. Every corridor bulb, every stateroom lamp, the lit clock on the grand staircase, all of it from steam raised in a room nobody upstairs will ever see. They help make heat. Steam is piped the length of the ship to warm the cabins, so that a passenger in the middle of the North Atlantic in April can sit in a nightgown and not shiver. They help move water. The ship carries fresh water in tanks deep inside her, and special equipment can turn seawater into more fresh water as the crossing goes on. But storage is only half of it. Every tap on this ship depends on pumps, and the pumps depend on steam. Turning a tap in a third-class washroom sets off a chain that ends 4 decks down at a furnace door. They power the cooling rooms, tens of thousands of eggs, tons of meat, fruit that will still be good in New York. Fire, several decks below, is what keeps the ice cream frozen. And they move air. Fans push warm air into the passenger decks and draw the hot, dusty air out of the boiler rooms. The reason a first-class corridor smells of nothing at all is that a machine is working hard elsewhere to make sure of it. They even heat the swimming bath on F deck, a heated pool of seawater in the middle of an ocean, warmed by coal. So picture a passenger in a first-class cabin at 11:30, reaching over to turn off the lamp beside the bed. It's the smallest gesture on the ship, a finger on a switch. That small pool of light existed because 4 dynamos were turning, because steam was arriving under pressure, because 29 boilers were burning, because teams of firemen and trimmers were maintaining the furnaces and moving coal through the darkness, and because a handful of engineers were standing at a row of dials making sure none of it faltered. The passenger doesn't think about any of it, and shouldn't have to. That is precisely what they paid for. Now we come to a part of the ship that sounds invented and isn't. On F deck, on the starboard side, below the waterline, there is a swimming pool. 30 feet long, 14 feet wide, filled with seawater and heated. There was a small charge to use it, and the men could swim free first thing in the morning. Forward of it, a squash court. It sits a deck lower still, just ahead of the boiler rooms, and it is built 2 decks high so the ball has somewhere to go. There is a small gallery above it for anyone who wants to watch. You paid by the half hour, and the ship carried its own professional, a young man of 23 whose job aboard was to play squash with the passengers. And between the pool and everything else, the Turkish baths. You went through a steam room, a hot room, a temperate one, and a room where you were washed, and then out into the last room of all, which is the reason this part of the ship is worth describing. They called it the cooling room. It was where you sat afterwards and did nothing. The portholes were hidden behind a carved wooden screen. The walls were tiled in blue and green. The ceiling was painted gold and deep red. Bronze lamps hung down from it. The woodwork was warm teak, carved all over. Low couches ran round the walls, with a small carved table beside each one, where you could put down a coffee or a book. A warm, dim, gold and blue room with couches below the surface of the Atlantic Ocean. 4 shillings to use it. The tickets still exist. We even have one passenger's opinion of the whole experience written in her diary. She said it was her first Turkish bath, and she hoped it would be her last, and that she had never disliked anything so much in her life. Though she did admit that she enjoyed the swim at the end. Now here is the detail I like best about this whole part of the ship, and it took reading the official report to notice it. There were 3 electric lifts in first class. They ran from E deck up to A deck. The pool and the Turkish baths are on F deck. The squash court is on G. The lifts didn't go down that far. So every single first-class passenger who wanted to swim or sit in that gilded room under the waterline or hit a ball around a court next to a boiler casing had to get out of the lift and walk down the rest of the way themselves. There were 4 lift attendants on this ship: William Carney, 31, Alfred King, 18, Frederick Blades, 17, whom he'd Allen and had come across from the Olympic, and Reginald Pacey, 17, who by most accounts had barely been to sea at all before this. Their job was to stand in a small moving room for the length of a working day and take people up and down. Lawrence Beasley, the schoolmaster with the notebook, wrote about the lift twice, and both passages are worth having. The first is about scale. He said that perhaps nothing gave one a greater impression of the size of the ship than to take the lift from the top and drop slowly down past the different floors, discharging and taking in passengers just as in a large hotel. That is what the lift was for, not luxury, orientation. It was the only way most people ever understood how tall the thing they were inside actually was. The second passage is about the boy. Beasley describes him as quite young, not more than 16, he thought, bright-eyed, and with a love for the sea and the games on deck and the view out over the ocean. Then Beasley adds one small detail, and he did not get any of them. One day, letting Beasley out, the boy saw through the vestibule windows a game of deck quoits going on, and the said, and this is recorded in a book published in 1912, so these are close to the actual words of an actual 17-year-old on this ship, "My, I wish I could go out there sometimes." Beasley offered to mind the lift for an hour so the boy could go and watch the game. He smiled and shook his head and dropped down in answer to a ring from below. That is the whole story. Nothing else happens in it. A boy wanted to go outside, was offered the chance, and went back to work. Come back up. It's nearly 1 o'clock and the third-class dining saloon is filling. Amidships on F deck. White painted walls, long tables under white cloths, and individual swivel chairs. A small mark of consideration, since the alternative on most ships is a fixed bench. It seats about 470, so third class eats in 2 sittings, and a steward walks the corridors beforehand ringing a bell. The food is what surprises people most. Breakfast might be oatmeal and milk, smoked herring, jacket potatoes, ham and eggs, bread and butter, and marmalade. The midday meal, the main one, soup, roast beef with gravy, vegetables, potatoes, and plum pudding after. Tea in the early evening, cold meat, cheese, pickles, bread and butter, and a light supper later on. Now hold that against the household most of these passengers came from. Meat is a Sunday event. Fruit is seasonal. Butter is measured. The idea that you might sit at a clothed table, be brought roast beef, then be brought pudding afterwards, and that it will happen again tomorrow and the day after, at no effort or expense of your own, is not a small thing. There's a version of this story that dwells on the gap between 11 courses upstairs and roast beef down here. The gap is real, but it's worth being accurate about which way the surprise ran for the people actually in this room. They weren't comparing this table with the dining saloon upstairs, which they had never seen and could not picture. They were comparing it with an ordinary weekday at home. There's one more room down here I want to show you before the evening starts. The ship's full name isn't the Titanic. It's the Royal Mail Ship Titanic. RMS. It's on the paperwork and the tickets, and it isn't decoration. It's a contract. This vessel carries the post, and the post has to keep moving. So on the lower decks there's a sorting room, and in it 5 men. 3 Americans and 2 Britons, employed not by the shipping line, but by their national postal services, working in a small room stacked with mail sacks. The ship carried thousands of mail sacks, somewhere around 3,500 of them. The number of individual letters inside was never precisely verified, but it ran into the millions. 5 men were expected to sort the lot before New York. Their job is to sort all of it, in transit, so that when the ship reaches New York, it can go straight on to trains. The crossing isn't dead time for them. It's 6 days of ordinary shift work in a windowless room below the waterline, while on the decks above people are eating, resting, talking, and getting ready for bed. And this is the part that stays with me. Among all of that, there would have been letters traveling between emigrants and the families they left behind. People who went out a year, or 5 years, or 20 years ago, writing home. I've found work. The winters are colder than they told us. Send the younger ones when you can. So the ship is carrying 2,200 people west across the Atlantic, and at the same time carrying millions of messages moving between the lives those people left and the lives other people have already built. 5 men in a windowless room, putting them in order. The ship also carried 2 doctors and a small hospital on D deck, ready for seasickness, for illness, and for the ordinary accidents that happen aboard any working vessel. Most crossings there was very little for them to do. The open deck these passengers were allowed was small, a stretch at the stern, and 2 low open wells, one forward and one aft. In April, in the North Atlantic, it is also cold. So after tea, third class gathers indoors, in one of 2 rooms. The smoking room, aft on C deck, is oak-paneled with teak furniture. That's where the men go, and where card games happen that everyone involved will later describe as friendly. The general room, on the same deck, is the heart of it, white pine paneling, teak benches and chairs, and an upright piano. And this is where the ship becomes genuinely strange and genuinely lovely because of who's in here. Third class on this crossing isn't one community, it's many sharing a room. Irish from Cork and Mayo and Galway, Swedes and Norwegians and Finns, a very large contingent, most of them bound for Minnesota and the Dakotas, Lebanese and Syrian families heading to relatives in Michigan and Pennsylvania, Bulgarians, Croatians, Italians, English families out of the industrial towns. Most of them cannot speak to one another at all. So the room finds other ways. Somebody plays. Somebody else knows the tune, or doesn't but can follow it, and joins in. There's a piper aboard, Eugene Daly from Athlone in Ireland, who played on deck as the ship left Queenstown and has his Irish pipes with him for the crossing. Children from families who cannot exchange a full sentence would still have found ways to play together, the way children always do, needing no translation at all. And the adults sit around the edges, watching, nodding, occasionally trying a word, mostly just being in the same warm, bright room as a lot of other people who are also going somewhere. I think this is the most human thing about third class on this ship. Everyone in this room is in the middle of the largest transition of their life. They have left. They have not arrived. For 6 days they exist in a state almost nobody occupies for long, genuinely between two places, the old one gone and the new one not yet real. And what they do with that suspended week is sit together in a bright room and share music with one another, even when they can't share a language. This next part is the reason I wanted to make this episode, and it comes almost entirely from one man who happened to pay attention. The ship vibrated, constantly, everywhere. Enormous steam engines turning 3 propellers 24 hours a day at the bottom of a steel box that every single person aboard was standing inside. Beasley, in second class, was directly above the after machinery. He describes sitting on the sofa in his cabin undressing, with bare feet on the floor, and feeling the vibration come up from the engines below very noticeably. He describes sitting up in his berth reading and feeling the spring mattress underneath him vibrating, and he calls the sensation cradle-like and says it was always noticeable as one lay in bed. Always noticeable. Not a fault, not an event. The normal condition of being in bed on this ship. And then he gives us the single best physical detail I have found anywhere in the literature of this crossing. He says that the vibration of the engines is most noticeable lying in a bath, because the throb comes straight up from the floor, through the metal sides of the bath, into you. And he adds, almost in passing, that it was too much so ordinarily for one to put one's head back with comfort against the bath. Sit with that for a second. On an ordinary night on this ship, on an ordinary crossing, you could not comfortably rest your head against the back of the bathtub because the engines were coming up through it. He noticed something else standing on deck, that the motion of the ship through the water resolved itself into 2 separate movements, a long, slow heave up and down, and a side-to-side roll. And what struck him was the almost clock-like regularity of the two. And there was one more thing, which is so ordinary and so odd that almost nobody mentions it. The ship leaned slightly to port during the crossing. You could see it from the second-class dining saloon. Out of the portholes on the port side, you could see the horizon and the sea, and out of the starboard side, you could see only sky. Beasley asked about it. The purser told him it was probably because the coal had been taken mostly from the starboard bunkers. A ship the length of 4 city blocks, sitting a degree or 2 off level, for 6 days, because of where the coal had been shoveled from. Nobody minded. Nobody, apparently, even thought it worth remarking on, except a school teacher who wrote things down. And here is the part about the vibration that matters most, and it's about how human beings work. They stopped noticing it. By the second day, nobody felt it at all. It had become, in Beasley's own phrase, part of our very existence. It was the floor. It was the bed. It was the bath. It was simply what being alive on the ship was like. That is what a ship is from the inside. A steady, warm, faintly moving room that you very quickly stop being able to feel at all. And people slept in it beautifully. It's late now. Let's find out who is still awake. The ship runs on watches, 4 hours on, 4 hours off, around the clock, and the pattern is shifted daily by splitting the late afternoon into 2 short watches, so that no man is condemned to the same hours forever. Every half hour a bell is struck, 1 bell at past, 2 at the hour, building through the watch until 8 bells ends it and the next 4 hours begin. The count resets. It starts again. If you are lying awake in a cabin on this ship, you can hear the ship counting. Down in the engine spaces, the watches are different, 3 of them instead of 2, 4 hours on and 8 off, because of what the work does to a body. The lookouts have it hardest in one specific way, 2 hours on, 4 off, day and night, standing in a steel bucket up a mast in the middle of the Atlantic in April, looking at nothing. Now, who else? There is a night watchman. His name was James Johnson, and he told the inquiry afterwards in about 8 words what his job was. I was night watchman. I had charge of the night watch. He came on at 11. His beat was E-deck, the reception room, and the pantry. He was asked who he found down there when he went below. He said, "All the boys were in bed when I went down there." And they asked him what he meant by the boys, and he said, "All the stewards. They are called boys." 300 and some grown men, many of them married, some of them in their 40s, and the word for them on this ship, the ordinary, unremarkable, everyday word, was boys. There is also a lamp trimmer. On a ship lit throughout by electricity, the title sounds old-fashioned, but the navigation lights and the backup oil lamps still needed looking after every single day. His name was Samuel Hemming, and he described his own work like this: to mix the paint and all that kind of thing for the ship, and to look after all the decks, trim all the lamps, and get them in proper order, to put the lights in at night time and take them off at daybreak. To put the lights in at night and take them off at daybreak. Every day, both ends of the day, for the whole crossing. And the bedroom stewards, the ones who have been on their feet since before the passengers were awake, do not simply finish and go to bed either. One of them told the inquiry that he turned in at 9:30 and was due back on at 12. So at 2 in the morning on an ordinary night, this is who is awake on this ship. An officer on the bridge, a quartermaster with his hands on the wheel, another standing by, another at the stern, 2 men up the mast, a full watch below feeding the furnaces, a night watchman walking E-deck, and a steward somewhere in a corridor on the midnight turn, waiting. Everyone else is asleep, and the ship is counting the half hours for them. One last thing before the ship goes properly dark, and it's a correction to something you may have read. You will find it said in a lot of places that the lights in 3rd class went out at 10 o'clock, by rule. I went looking for where that comes from. It isn't in the inquiries. It isn't in any account written by anyone who was there. As far as I can establish, nobody wrote it down because it wasn't a rule. What we have instead is better because somebody actually saw it. Beasley, walking back to his cabin late, passed a steward leaning against a staircase, not doing anything, just standing there. And Beasley worked out what he was doing and wrote it down. He was probably waiting until the people in the smoking room above had gone to bed so that he could put out the lights. That's how the ship went dark. Not a bell, not a curfew, not an announcement. A man leaning on a staircase, waiting for the last passengers to stop talking. And around him, elsewhere on the same ship at the same hour, Other stewards were standing about with biscuits and coffee, waiting to serve them so that they could finally go off duty. Saturday, the 13th of April, late. The general room has emptied, the piano's closed, the stewards have been through and the lights are down to the night setting. Dim bulbs at long intervals, enough to walk by. Behind the closed doors along these corridors, families are settled into narrow cabins around iron berths. Coats on hooks, shoes under bunks, cases pushed into whatever space there is. Forward in the single men's accommodation, Daniel Buckley, 21, from County Cork, shares a room with 3 other young men from the same part of Ireland. Aft, in the family section, the Sages occupy several berths between them. We can't know the small private facts of any of these rooms. Who stayed awake longest, which child had to be settled twice, what the last thing said in the dark was. Nobody wrote it down, and it would be easy to invent, and I'd rather not. What we can see is the pattern. Hundreds of people going gradually still along a corridor while the ship goes on working underneath them. Above them, the great rooms are dark, chairs pushed in, the clock on the staircase ticking to nobody. And below all of it, nothing has stopped. In the boiler rooms, the watch that came on at 8 is halfway through, feeding the fires exactly as they were fed at noon. The trimmers are dragging coal forward in the dark. In the engine room, an oiler moves along a line of bearings with the back of his hand. In the sorting room, 5 men are still putting letters in order. In the bakery, the ovens will be lit in a few hours, because there's bread to make for 2,000 people, and bread doesn't keep. And on Scotland Road there's someone walking, carrying something, going somewhere. What every person aboard shares tonight, whether they paid £7 or 800, is some awareness of the ship in motion. High in the vessel it may be little more than a faint tremor through the floor, easy to stop noticing. Down near the working decks it's stronger, coming up through the bunks and the steel partitions, closer to a fact than a sound. It doesn't reach everyone equally, but it crosses boundaries that almost nothing else aboard this ship can cross. The same machinery is carrying every one of them west. We'll leave the Titanic here, still moving west through the dark. The bakery will start another morning's bread in a few hours. A fresh watch will take its place in front of the furnaces. Letters will go on passing from one sorting table to the next. Along the passenger corridors, the lamps stay low and the doors stay closed. Everything aboard continues in its own quiet rhythm, and none of it asks anything more from us. Let the details go now. The coal, the corridors, the long steel passage with somebody always in it, the quiet rooms, and the dark water beyond the hull. You don't need to carry any of it with you. The ship is a long way off now. The engines are only a low vibration somewhere under the night. Rest well.